How long have you been 17?
I am a vampire, and you are mortal.
Hello and welcome to This Podcast Sucks.
The show where we take a bite out of the vampire genre.
We'll be following all manner of fanged fiends through the past 127 years of film and television.
From Nosferatu to Twilight, I'm your host, Tara.
And I'm your host, Elliot.
For our first full episode, we'll be covering the classic film and pillar of horror cinema, F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. But Elliot, I thought Dracula with Bela Lugosi was the first vampire film. Why is Nosferatu the first vampire film?
Well, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, released in 1931, might be the most famous early vampire film or the most iconic vampire film. Our first blood drinker is in Nosferatu. So Nosferatu was released in 1922, almost 10 years before Bela Lugosi's Dracula. And so, as Tara said, it was directed by F.W. Murnau. And our screenplay for this film was written by Henrik Galeen. Excuse my pronunciation of these German names. And so for our cast, we have Max Schreck as Count Orlok, Gustav von Wangenheim as Thomas Hutter. While Bela Lugosi's Dracula, released in 1931, might be the most famous early vampire film or the most iconic when we think about vampire cinema, we find our first blood drinker in Nosferatu, which is actually full-titled Nosferatu Symphony of Horror. And this was released in 1922, and as Tara mentioned, directed by F.W. Murnau. The screenplay was written by Henrik Galeen. And for our cast, we have Max Schreck as Count Orlok, Gustav von Wangenheim as Thomas Hutter, Greta Schroeder as Ellen Hutter, Alexander Granach as Nock, George H. Schnell as shipowner Harding, and Ruth Landshoff as Ruth. And then we've got some other actors, obviously, fleshing out our cast, but these are our main players.
The film was produced by Prana Film, which was founded in 1921 by Enrico Diekmann and occultist Albin Grau, who, fun fact, was a member of a Hermetic order named Fraternitas Saturni, which is Latin for Brotherhood of Saturn, referencing the Roman god of time, the harvest, and death. And he also used the magic name Master Pasitius. I am not sure if I'm pronouncing that, but either way, you can now tell your friends that this film was produced by a production company that was founded by an occultist. And the studio was meant to produce occult and supernatural films, but it folded and declared bankruptcy not long after the release of the film, which was its only production.
I'll just say, I love anyone who has a stage name or like a second identity for themselves. It feels very vampiric and spooky to have this like other kind of occult life. And so in line with occultism and some of those spooky, creepy vibes, this film is known for its influences from dark romanticism, its inspirations from literary expressionism, and it's often considered one of the earliest examples of a German expressionist film, alongside films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And so if you want to take it away with some more details about the film's production and its release.
Yeah, absolutely. So the film was released in the Netherlands first on February 16th, 1922, and its German premiere was kind of split across these two events. There was a high society premiere on March 4th, where guests arrived in costume dressed as peasants. And its big screen debut took place a little over a week later on March 15th.
So that was the premiere of the film, but that still leaves what the film actually was. So tell us a bit about what these peasants were there to see.
I'm so glad you asked, Elliot, because this film is one about vampires. But first, the setting. It takes place in 1838 in the fictional German town of Visburg and follows Thomas Hutter, who is a real estate agent, or I suppose you would call him a solicitor at that time, who was given a task of going to Transylvania in the service of a new client named Count Orlok, who plans to buy a house right across from Hutter's in Germany. Now, as Thomas Hutter makes his journey through Transylvania, he starts to notice some shady things going on, and a lot of people telling him that he really shouldn't be going to visit this count. Now, Elliot, if this is sounding a bit familiar to you, it's because it is. This film is notorious for unofficially adapting Bram Stoker's novel Dracula without any copyright.
We love a thief.
And we especially love it when they don't really go out of their way to hide it, aside from changing some names around.
Yes, that is one thing that we will discuss a bit more, because as we were preparing for this episode, we just discovered that we watched two different versions of the film. Because in my version, the credits show Max Schreck as playing Dracula and not Nosferatu. And so there's some inconsistencies with the names that indicate some of the copyright infringement we have going on here.
Right. Because when I saw that, I went, excuse me, these are not the names that were made up in a blatant attempt to rip off this property. This is not Count Orlok or Ellen. I think they changed Mina to Ellen. And that could be because the film entered the public domain in 2019. So for all of our listeners, just be aware that there are a couple of versions that are floating around for free, and some will have different scores, different aspects of the film that are changed, such as the tinting for scenes, and in the case of Elliot here, putting the names back to the original character counterpoints in the book.
Yes. And so you are the Dracula expert. You have read the book. And you've seen more of the Dracula films and media iterations than I have.
Yeah, and I will say that the majority of the film is actually pretty faithful in terms of the journey that for the purposes of this episode here, I'm just going to call the Jonathan character. It is pretty faithful in regards to it to being about, hey, we have this guy who's a solicitor here, and he's kind of an idiot, and he's just going to be making a long, perilous journey to what I'm sure European audiences or readers at the time thought was, oh my gosh, the very foreign, exotic land of Transylvania. And he will be meeting with this new client that he will become aware of very early on, as if he didn't have enough red flags telling him not to go meet this guy, is there might be a little something shady about him, and he might just want to drink his blood and take over all of Europe, which has its own connotations and issues we'll be getting into later on in this episode. But yeah, in terms of characterization, basic beats of the plot, it's all pretty similar. Things only really start changing up a bit when Count Orlok heads back to Germany in the film, bringing pestilence and the plague with him. And again, we will get more into that as the episode goes on.
Yes, but another example. Oh, I was just going to say another example of rats getting a bad rap in media.
Yes, it's so unfair. And yeah, on the one hand, we like to see some faithfulness when it comes to adaptation. Not that faithful adaptations are always the best adaptations, but in this case, it's just really funny because I don't know how they thought they were just going to get away with this. They changed so little aside from the ending, and yeah.
I think that questions around adaptation and myth and folklore are going to come up a lot over the course of our discussions about all of these different vampire films and TV shows, because vampires are like a very ancient figure, and so this concept of like who owns a vampire story? Can a vampire story be owned? Because the notion of a being that sustains itself through the consumption of blood is global. Practically every culture, ancient or contemporary, on this planet has an idea of a vampire or, a being that survives off of blood. So I think that the fact that this is coming up so early is really indicative of some of the major things that interest us about vampires. And there's so many other ways that manifests in this film in terms of starting off some of the trends that we see to this day, over 100 years later in vampire media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Elliot, would you like to talk a little bit more about the production and more formal aspects of this film?
Yes, I would be happy to, because there are so many things going on with this film that are really beautiful and lovely just within the context of the film, but are also really interesting in the larger context of cinema. And so we talked a bit about the influences of German Expressionism and this film's role in the generation of that form and style in cinema. So some other details are that this film was released in 1922, but filming took place over 3 months in 1921. And this was a pretty high-risk production in terms of, it was on a shoestring budget. There were a lot of technical constraints. They only had access to one camera, and I'm sure that many of you are aware, but for those who don't know, film and film stock is incredibly expensive. It remains expensive. It's always been expensive. And so only one negative was created of this film because of those financial constraints. And so a film negative is sort of what it sounds like in terms of the colors are flipped, and it's the master from which all other versions of the film were made. And so that affected the production in a few ways. One of the most significant ones, I think, is in terms of the acting and the blocking. So one thing that I read about when researching this was that because this is a silent film, the director and, all of the other crew people behind the camera were able to communicate with the actors while shots were happening. So because film stock was so limited, because time and resources were so limited, the director actually utilized a metronome to make sure that actors were hitting the right beats and moving at the appropriate pace for the shot that was planned. Galeen, our scriptwriter, also included extensive notes on the script. So there was a lot of writing in the margins on things like the lighting, the framing, camera angles, the locations, like the details of the set. And for anyone who is experienced with screenwriting, many of those things are atypical now and might actually even be considered rude or inappropriate to include in the script. Because these days we have this idea that the screenwriter's job is to write and that the director's job is to make decisions about things like framing, set design, location, light, and that then the cinematographer makes decisions on how best to execute that vision. So even just, talking about this film, we can see how much has changed, and, the traditions that we might consider to be ubiquitous are actually fairly recent and modern inventions.
And we love to see a professional, well planned out set.
Yes, the the benefits of a micromanager in this particular case. Yes, and so speaking of these financial constraints and some of the difficulties this production faced, Tara, would you like to tell us the tale of... We've talked about the tale of Nosferatu a little bit. Would you like to tell us the tale of Prana and the tale of how this film was made and distributed to the public and the consequences that arose?
Yes, absolutely. Wikipedia and I would love to flesh out that story for you. So as mentioned, Nosferatu was produced by the very short-lived Prana Film, which was a German studio that was established with the intention of making supernatural and occultist films. Yeah, so as Wikipedia is telling me here, Diekman and Grau gave Henrik Galeen, I am not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, apologies if not, the task of writing a screenplay inspired by the Dracula novel. Although, it's early film production period, so what's copyright? What's film rights? We don't need that. Just adapt it. What's the worst that could happen? Well, I will tell you. So, Bram Stoker's widow at the time, I am trying to find her name here.
And this woman was, if we had time, it would be fascinating to talk about this woman, because apparently she was an incredibly in-demand kind of socialite before her marriage. She was courted by many men, including Oscar Wilde.
What?
Yes, yeah. So quite a woman.
Her power, yeah.
Yes,
her power extended to the gays as well.
Yes,
so
yeah. She must have had some sort of special something for Oscar Wilde to be, seeking her hand and her time. So
yeah, absolutely. So as I have found, her name is Florence Balcone. So she had basically total control of his estate and the rights to his works. So, understandably, she was pretty pissed about this copyright infringement, and she launched a lawsuit, and the suit took a little bit of time to resolve, at which point Prana Film declared bankruptcy because they couldn't afford to pay to adapt it. So, better to ask forgiveness than permission, I guess, but
yes.
Kind of ended up destroying Prana Film and all of the potential supernatural spooky films we could have gotten in the future. So, finally, she won the case, and the ruling was declared in July 1925, stating that all negatives and prints of the film should be handed over to her and destroyed. Now, despite this ruling, prints of the film slowly began to resurface in the late 1920s, with American screenings taking place in New York City and Detroit in 1929. So, I could be wrong, but I believe technically there was only one print of this film that survived, that was secretly kept, and that is the print we have today. So we were very, very, very close to losing this film entirely, like a great majority of silent films. Think about, it's said that about 90% of silent films are considered lost, and Nosferatu was very close to becoming another one of those films. But thankfully survived, but still, copyright laws exist for a reason, so...
Yeah, and you mentioned that we almost lost this film, and one interesting fact is that the actual first vampire film was a Russian film called Dracula with a K, and that film was made in 1920, apparently, and it has been lost to time, and to the degree that some film historians dispute that this film ever even existed. But it's entirely possible that 2 years before Nosferatu, there was a different Russian film that committed a vampire to screen for the first time. But unfortunately, if such a film even did exist, we lost it many, many decades ago.
Do you think they got the copyright, Elliot?
That's a great question. Probably not. Yeah, because I feel like maybe if they had, they would have had a bit of a better chance of survival. I also think that if they had achieved copyright, there wouldn't be as much of a dispute about whether or not this film ever even existed. So to err on the side of caution, I mentioned this film, but it's entirely possible that this film, like vampires, is a myth.
What? Elliot, don't tell me that now. Okay, yeah, so I think, yeah, we've laid out basically just kind of the whole history of this film here and its production. And do we maybe want to just kind of get into it now?
Yes, get into the film itself. What happens during that runtime? So, as you have kindly done, we've been given a bit of a plot overview of the broad strokes of this film. But I think that perhaps it is we might best be served by starting at the start with our opening shot of this film. Which...
Also, just oh, sorry, I just wanted like one quick question. Had you seen Nosferatu before?
I had not seen Nosferatu before. I actually have don't tell anyone. But I actually have very limited experience with silent film and silent cinema. Yes, I'm a terrible film student, terrible scholar.
God, what are you doing, Elliot? I I don't know if I mentioned it before in the previous episode. I did get a major in film studies in undergrad, so I did take a silent film course. And yes, this was not one of the films we watched. We actually watched The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. I did watch this film for another class, which was basically about how evil is represented in media. And I wrote a little part of a final paper was about this movie. So I had seen the film before. It had been a few years, but I think for some of our other listeners, you'd probably be familiar with this film as well through the inclusion of Nosferatu's Count Orlok at the end of the SpongeBob episode, where Squidward and SpongeBob are working the night shift at the Krusty Krab, and they ask who was flickering the lights. So that might have been some people's introduction to this. But yes, I was more familiar with this film, but it was fun to watch again after so many years, and by so many years I mean like 5.
Well, three of those years were COVID years, so exactly. Might as well have been a century.
Oh my god! Yeah, exactly. So yes, back to you, Elliot. Let's get a little bit more into this plot and this film with the opening scene.
Yes, yeah. So the reason that I wanted to talk about the opening shot is because it kind of speaks to some of the larger themes within the film. And so our opening shot is a town square, and there's in the foreground we have like a church tower, a bell tower, and we kind of see the square like through the church tower. And so I think that this is a really interesting place to start in our discussion, but also in the film, because this film is very much about space and about place and about communities and kind of like not necessarily nationalism, because like specific countries aren't necessarily well, he does cross the border into Transylvania, but the idea of the community space and like a religious community space is very important to the film, and protecting those spaces more specifically. And it also brings up some interesting things about this film, because as Tara has mentioned to me, actually, a lot of this film was shot on location rather than on constructed sets, which was pretty unusual for the time. And so this is where our film starts. And then we very quickly get introduced to our two main characters. I think it might literally be called The Book of Vampires.
Yeah, keeping it nice and clear. But this book, kind of lists out the rules of vampires as they function in this universe, in this film, such as needing to sleep in coffins, only being able to travel with consecrated soil. Again, all from Bram Stoker's novel.
Just a quick note, it's the soil, specifically the soil that they were buried in.
Oh, okay, yes, the soil that they were buried in. Thank you. But yeah, also, yeah, just once again starting our classic, explain how vampires work in a vampire film and or show, and laying out those kind of ground rules there. Of course, Jonathan R. Thomas really doesn't pay much attention to that book. But a much smarter character, his wife, will, later on.
Yes, yeah. Nina Ellen Nina.
Yeah, Nina Ellen, I love that.
She's really the brains of this operation, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The Van Helsing character does nothing in this movie.
The Van Helsing character is interesting.
He is, which, yes. We will get to him. And we will also get to Mina Nina. No, oh my gosh. I can't. Because her friend is named Nina in the movie, which is so close to Mina.
Yes.
So we will get to the Mina/Ellen character, who is always a very interesting character in many adaptations and in the book as well. A lot of people don't know, I think, how interesting her character is. But back to Jonathan Thomas and our first kind of real introduction to Count Orlok when he comes out of the shadows. And still incredibly creepy and effective. It speaks so much, I think, to Murnau's abilities as a director, and also to arguably, I could say, the most memorable / best part of this movie, which is Max Schreck as Count Orlok.
Yes, it is a very, very striking kind of first sight. There's horror films. There's always a lot built up around that first time that you see the monster. And so I think that this is a great example of that money shot almost. It's simple but effective. I think the camera, we got our one camera locked down on a tripod, and I want to say it's like a long shot, medium long shot, which for our listeners just means people in the frame. It's from feet to the head. They can see all of that, and they can kind of see more of their surroundings. But and we just see the dark kind of cavernous void of the castle and a figure slowly walking out straight to the camera from it. And it is Count Orlok in his very striking, very iconic makeup, but also makeup that comes with its own problematic implications, which, do you want to get into that now, Elliot, or maybe later? Yeah, I think we can kind of preface it here and then kind of get into the meat of it a little more later. Sure. But one of the things about his costuming is, he has our actor Max Schreck was quite tall, so he's this very thin, looming figure with these kind of long, kind of bat pointy ears, very long nose. And very visible, sharp teeth. And unlike our kind of modern image of vampires as having two sharp incisors, two fangs, Count Orlok's, all of his teeth are sharp and all of his teeth are fang-like. And he has like a bit of a hunchback and very, very long fingers that end in these kind of claws. And there's a lot of discussion about how many consider this to be related to or like a direct example of an anti-Semitic caricature of a Jewish person. And that is something that we'll talk about in terms of like the costuming and the visual design, but also the implications for like the larger story, because this film is about the other. And it is about otherness, and it is also about xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment, and the idea of an invading force from the outside, bringing destruction, bringing death, bringing illness. And so that is a very significant element of this shot, and sort of the cultural relevance and the cultural effect of this film. Another thing that I want to mention about this shot that Tara kind of touched on is like, this kind of wider framing that shows like the building, and that Orlok is kind of emerging from the shadows of this building. He is framed by a stone archway, and he kind of comes from the shadows of this archway. And that is a really common technique that is returned throughout the film, is a frame within a frame. So characters framed by doorways, framed by arches, framed by tunnels through the castle and things like that. So that is a really lovely and beautiful kind of element of the film that produces some of those striking shots that, you know, remain impressive to this day. So it's, you know, it's interesting that this moment is kind of one of the strongest moments of the film visually, but it also introduces one of the most kind of contentious or controversial elements of the film, which is the relationship to anti-Semitism and to really harmful stereotypes and cultural images built up around the Jewish faith and Jewish people.
Yeah, definitely. And as Elliot said, this is all things we will get more into as we go along. And segue, but for anyone who is interested, the castle that Count Orlok / Dracula's castle was, the setting was the Orava Castle, which is a castle situated above the Orava River in a village in Slovakia. I'm hesitating to pronounce the village's name because I just don't want to butcher it, but yeah, Wikipedia here says it is considered to be one of the most beautiful castles in Slovakia, and yeah, it looks like it's still standing.
Which is actually the case for a decent number of the buildings and facades that we see in the film.
Yes.
Many of them remain standing, and, you know, you can go visit these places and live out your own little Nosferatu moment.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I hate to be that person. It's like, all beautiful, love that it's accurate, and, you know, these are real castles and the setting. Like, that's all so cool, but gosh, I'm just like, can it be a little bigger? I want a big old gothic, just video game castle. Like, I want the castle, like Dracula's castle in Castlevania that fucking moves.
Yes, it is
and teleports.
It is a bit of a conservatively sized castle.
Yes, it is conservatively sized. It's you know, we'll get more into those castles as we go on through our vampire film history. I think kind of culminating with the Bram Stoker's Dracula. That castle is a character in and of itself. But getting back to the story, Thomas / Jonathan meets Count Orlok. You know, nothing weird about this guy at all. Has a nice meal planned for him. And at this meal, while Jonathan / Thomas is giving Orlok a lot of side-eyeing, he cuts his finger while trying to slice off a piece of lovely bread for his meal.
In what is possibly an example of the worst and dumbest way to slice a slice of bread.
It was giving Kendall Jenner trying to cut a cucumber vibes a bit.
Yeah, or Benedict Cumberbatch slicing a tomato.
Yeah, it's like, oh my gosh, guys, never cut towards yourself.
Yes.
Never, for any situation, whatever you're doing with a sharp object, cut away.
Yes, and he really gets a grip on the whole loaf. You know, not very much in the spirit of sharing. He's just like, gets the whole thing.
Yeah, and I mean, it didn't seem too tough. It seemed like it would have been reasonable to just rip it off, a piece off with your hand. But then we wouldn't have our iconic scene, again, from the book. I'm pretty sure, again, it's been a while since I've read the book, and, like, sometimes these scenes just become so ingrained into, like, the Dracula film canon. You're almost like, wait, was that in the book, or is that just something that's been in these films for so long? Now we have to have it. But yeah, so Jonathan / Thomas cuts himself, and Orlok goes, "Your precious blood," and tries to get a big old, I don't know, suck taste of that blood coming out of the thumb, to which Jonathan Thomas...
he shows inappropriate interest.
He shows inappropriate interest. He invades some personal space there. And this is the moment where I think Jonathan, it finally clicks. Like, he realizes maybe this dude is not on the up and up.
I think he was, we do get the sense that he was a little uncomfortable or even frightened by Orlok's appearance.
Yeah.
And he was a little caught off guard by the carriage.
Yes.
And so, but you're right that this is the first time that we see, like, true fear or true doubt about this situation and the legitimacy of the real estate deal that he's supposed to be there for. And he does seem to be a bit concerned for his safety for the first time.
Yes, the self-preservation instincts finally kick in. And so another kind of effective thing, I think this really speaks to Max Schreck's instincts as an actor and his performance. And also, fun fact, he went apparently full method and stayed in character throughout this shoot, which I think I remember reading, like, he honestly scared some production members, understandably.
Yes.
Like, it's such a, it's a striking appearance, and just going back to the strength of his acting instincts and choices, the stillness. I appreciate how still and deliberate his movements are. And as we see in the scene where Jonathan Thomas is, backing away very visibly distressed and in a lot of fear, and Count Orlok just slowly walks up to him and kind of backs Jonathan into this chair almost. And Orlok's just like, all right, I hope you are hope you enjoy late night talks, because we're gonna stay up, we're gonna party, because gosh, when the sun comes up, I gotta sleep. So
yes, there is something. There is like an intimacy to the moment. Yes, because he, he comes close to him and he's like, "Your precious blood," in a bit of a creepy way, but also perhaps in a hostly manner. He does kind of back him into this armchair by the fire, and he's like, "Let's sit, let's talk." So yes, you're right. It is funny that he's like, "Oh, you've just traveled by carriage for, possible weeks on end. Why don't we sit and talk till the dawn?"
After I just tried to drink the blood from your thumb. Yeah, no, I'm glad you pointed that out. There is an intimacy to it. For our listeners who do not know, F.W. Murnau was a gay man. So it's entirely possible that the kind of homoerotic subtext, which was already there in the original novel between Jonathan and Dracula, is being kind of hinted at a little bit here, perhaps. And maybe, I could be wrong, but perhaps Jonathan's fear in this moment is not necessarily directly related to the fact that his host just tried to drink his blood.
It's his no homo moment where he's like,
yes,
I don't sit by the fire
and talk with guys who just try to suck my thumb.
Yes. I think it's also important to mention because desire is such a massive part of vampire lore, vampire iconography, the metaphors that we use vampires for, like the desire for blood, the desire for eternal life, the desire for violence and savagery,
and like the desire to be consumed by another entity, almost like
absolutely. Desire going in both ways, our desire for vampires and then vampires' desire for us and for the flesh.
Yeah, absolutely. Desire is a huge component of that. And kind of segueing into sort of the next scene where Count Orlok sees the portrait of the Mina/Ellen character, who is Thomas's wife, we get into this idea of especially in subsequent vampire media, of the vampire finding or seeing one person. It is typically a woman because society, and it being like, that one, like, you are the special. You
are the delicious one.
You are the delicious one. You will be my partner in eternity forever. And so I think because that was not necessarily, that is a thing in the original Bram Stoker novel, which I think more has to do with the kind of racist implication of the other coming in and taking these pure British white women, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
For his quote unquote own. That is still the case in this movie, but in terms of just, I think, establishing like this, kind of romantic element. I don't know if romantic element is the right term, but having essentially a human character as a romantic potential for the vampire character. I think that is kind of first established here. And again, it's typically heterosexual. It's typically a male vampire, and it's typically a female woman.
And specifically, I don't know if it's in this scene or in a later scene, but it is specifically foregrounded as well, like the purity of these women. And yes, Ellen and Thomas are married, so there isn't necessarily the implication of a virgin or virgin blood. It does, the book that they're reading does specifically mention a woman who's pure of heart. And so, like you're saying, that ties into this idea of an outside force corrupting, because it's not just like a white woman that we're protecting. It's like a pure of heart, a kind, gentle, white woman who needs protection.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very traditionally feminine kind of conservative female character. But as we'll get into later on, I think there's some interesting elements to the Ellen Mina character, as there are in the book. But yeah, so in this scene, while Jonathan Thomas is sealing the deal, and by deal I mean real estate deal.
Yes, yeah.
This real estate deal, and Count Orlok sure does love mentioning how it's going to be great that they're neighbors.
Yes, he comments. Jonathan Thomas is really trying to get Orlok to sign some papers, and Orlok is really just interested in talking about Ellen's lovely throat. And how excited he is to be across the way. Yeah,
a subtle drop. When you see your bro's partner on social media.
The totally normal first thing to say.
Your wife has a lovely neck. So yes, and I think that scene is, I could be wrong. There are a few scenes in the castle where Jonathan Thomas is kind of like, oh, it's daytime, it's fine. Oh, this is great. What was I so stressed about the night before? He writes a letter to Mina Ellen. But then there is the famous scene where Count Orlok first comes to him at night to drink his blood.
It's actually the second time that he drinks his blood. It's the first time that we see it, because before the signing of the papers, we have another kind of idyllic waking up where Jonathan Thomas kind of wakes in the chair and he stretches and he's like
such a morning person.
Yes, he loves it. And then he looks in a mirror and the image is too washed out, but we do learn in a card that he sees bite marks on his neck. And when he writes his letter to Ellen, he describes the bite marks and says, some sort of insect, I don't know, but don't worry about me. Everything's great, essentially.
Yeah, we love to see the optimism.
Yes.
And yes, so we have the very famous scene of Dracula, Count Orlok, coming to drink Jonathan Thomas's blood for the second time, and again we get that kind of recurring or that repeated image here of him slowly walking towards the camera, which is very creepy and effective. Gives me I don't like that. I was always afraid as a kid of like just being in my bed and like something like coming towards the bed, kind of like out of the shadows.
The dread of your space, of your bed being invaded.
Exactly. And yes, and this is also where we cut back to Germany and we see Mina/Ellen character who has been staying with some friends. We see that she might be psychic.
Yes. Some questionable telepathic psychic abilities.
Yes, and I think this is the kind of the first time this is introduced with the Mina character. I want to say this was not in the Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. There was the issue of her being connected to Dracula after he makes her drink his blood towards the end of the book, but this is the first example I think of in films, definitely in films, maybe ever, of the Mina/Ellen character having almost this kind of psychic connection with Dracula or Count Orlok. And that kind of feeds into like the larger changes in her character that I think is retained in subsequent adaptations, where Mina in the book goes from this very kind of, super, just like super intelligent, rational, like working class, quote unquote, modern woman, hardworking Protestant ethic, middle class, she's learning shorthand, she's a school teacher, like she is like the modern woman in some regards. And I think this is movie with its characterization is the first time we kind of get the change of Mina into like a gothic psychic girl here.
Yes, with delicate sensibilities. We mostly see Nina kind of looking wistfully through windows or wistfully at the sea, and she does quite a bit of swooning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but don't get me wrong, I do love my Mina as psychic goth girl.
Yes. Good for her.
Good for her. We get that a lot in the Bram Stoker's Dracula adaptation. But yeah, so we are cross-cutting between the scene of Count Orlok having drunk Jonathan's blood and Mina/Ellen having this kind of premonition, or basically she has the Obi-Wan I feel it, a great disturbance in the Force. And I also wrote this down because she was sleepwalking as well, which was concerning to her hosts, who called the doctor. And the doctor says, harmless blood congestions. I'm like, my dude, that's a blood clot.
Well, this is again a fascinating difference, because for me it said a sudden fever. And fever is actually attributed to several different things. Jonathan Thomas's boss, who also develops a kind of strange relationship with Orlok, he is also committed for a fever. And when Jonathan Thomas himself is being treated for, he becomes sick as well. The nurse that is attending to him also tells him that he is afflicted with a fever.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, well, that makes a lot more sense than a doctor calmly saying this woman has a blood clot. So,
yes, and I think it fits with this notion of immigrants bringing illness, because there have been a lot of times throughout history where xenophobic sentiment has kind of been undergirded by the idea of, like a yellow fever or a Spanish flu, or, like many other kind of examples throughout history. So I think in some ways fever also kind of speaks to this idea of the other, perhaps a bit better than mysterious, benign blood clots.
Yes, so we come back to a shot of the sunrise, which, we gotta have our visual motifs to tell us when it is night and when it is day, because it's always day in this film.
Yes.
And we get Jonathan Thomas kind of exploring the castle some more and finding Dracula sleeping in his coffin, first ever visual filmic depiction of a vampire in their coffin, and very creepy, I might add, because Dracula is sleeping with his eyes open and he's completely still. It is a very creepy shot.
Yes, I was like, whoa.
Yeah. Like
eyes open. Yeah.
Yeah, eyes open, a la Gandalf in Return of the King. Yeah, no, very very creepy shot, absolutely. And then we cut pretty soon to Dracula getting ready for the big move. Doing all of the work himself, which he didn't have to do in the book. In the book, like, he outsourced that. He hired some local movers, but here we see him speed loading his coffins on.
Yes, yeah. There were a few moments where the frame rate is manipulated to make something happen faster, so the film is sped up a bit. And I think that happens like 3 or 4 times throughout the film.
Yes. So yeah, Dracula gets ready for the move and heads off. Oh no! And Jonathan manages to escape by lowering himself a hefty 20 feet, it looks like, from the castle window.
Yes. Yeah, with his nice, again, a sort of kind of cartoonish, almost like a bedsheet rope that he constructs.
Oh yeah, the classic bedsheet rope. And again, it's just, speaks to the realistic size of this castle, so it's
yes, the castle wall that you can that you can that you can climb with a twin-size bed sheet.
Pretty much, like I said, it looks like he was dropping himself from about 20 feet, but he escapes. So the Demeter, and I was surprised watching this movie how much we kind of hung out on this ship and with the crew, because this is usually glossed over in a lot of Dracula adaptations.
I think the pacing is unique in this film. The pacing is interesting. So you're right that it does feel like, oh, we're on a boat now, and we kind of stay on the boat for an interesting amount of time. You're correct.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, even before we're on the boat, there is the scene of them just getting the coffins and kind of doing a logistical outline of the shipments and everything, and they find a bunch of rats. And this brings us to another recurring motif in the movie, which is rats, the plague. So much rat hate in this movie. I think at this point we're also introduced to the Van Helsing character. I forget what his name is in this movie, but we'll just call him the Van Helsing character, and he is introduced as a professor giving a kind of study, like a case study exhibit on the nature of the Venus flytrap, because symbolism.
Yes, the carnivorous. I think he calls it the like the first carnivore of the world of vegetables or something.
I love that.
Yes,
first carnivore of the world of vegetables. Yes. So again, we get that kind of that theme of nature, and the film's focus on nature and it's the natural processes of animals, insects, plants, and almost that kind of documentarian look at this, with the close-up of the Venus flytrap closing over the fly. And so then, also, I think this is where Van Helsing's character says, "The blood is the life." Very famous line in Dracula movies. And let's see, then we get back to the ship. Beautiful, long kind of tracking shot closing in on the ship. When I first saw that, I was like, wait a minute, how'd they do that? I'm like, oh, another ship.
There's several very impressively steady shots of the waves and the water.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so really, really impressive camera work happening on the ship.
Yeah, and so we get to the Demeter, and can I just say, this crew was rocking some looks.
Yes,
I don't know. Were these mutton chops real? That is the question.
There's a lot of interesting facial hair
Yeah, like
in the film.
yeah, like one of the captains yeah, had a lot of hair. It was just a very hairy man. And like again, we see that kind of early silent film makeup look, which makes everyone kind of look very striking because their faces are just caked with makeup. And yeah, a very hairy crew. And they start to realize that their passengers are becoming ill. And we come to another famous shot of Dracula rising out of the coffin, like just plank straight, super stiff, just rises straight up and then stands very still. A very striking, memorable image.
Yes.
Also very creepy.
Yes. And significant cinematically because this was actually one of the earliest examples of stop motion. Yes, so the techniques they used to create that shot later went on to become like the techniques that we used for stop motion animation.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. And so yeah, Count Orlok makes his way through the crew and kills them off before the ship arrives in Weisburg, Germany, bringing plague and pestilence and rats and
yes,
the implications.
Yes, we have this amusing moment where they unload the coffins and open it, and just like a swarm of rats comes out, and almost at like all but one of the shipyard workers just flees, and then there's one brave guy who tries to fight the rats off with a shovel.
Oh yeah.
And...
yeah. Yeah. So, you know, he's bringing death and plague with him, and again, I know I keep saying it, but there's just so many iconic shots of this character. Another iconic shot is of a low-angle shot of Dracula walking kind of across the ship very slowly. Looks great. And then we get to Dracula just strolling around with his coffin, you know, in the streets.
Yes, I was curious if the implication there is that he has like enhanced strength or super strength, that he's able to carry his 6-foot-long dirt-filled coffin.
I would think so, because he already has like super speed apparently, because he loaded them up so fast.
Yeah, and he floated. You know, we had this, and he also we also get the sense that he's able to become incorporeal or turn invisible. You know, where we have a moment where we have 2 moments, I believe, where he walks through walls.
Yeah, another sort of similar thing from the book where he could basically, they say something like Dracula can turn tight, like he can slip through keyholes. Like, I don't. Okay,
nice.
That's one trick, I guess. But yes, so we get Dracula finally deboarding and trying to find a place, or I guess, well, his place that he bought to place his coffins. But meanwhile, there is turmoil in the streets of Weisburg as people are being struck ill suddenly with this plague. And I think at this point, Jonathan/Thomas has made it back home.
Yes, he has. And but he had to stay in a hospital. It was a struggle. Or a nunnery, I think. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Violent brain fever. You know. Yes. Victorian illness.
Fever of the brain.
Fever of the brain.
Yes.
Yes. So he comes back to warn his guests, and during this time, Ellen/Mina finds the vampire book that was at the inn Jonathan had stayed at, outlining the rules of vampires and how they function. And this is where she reads that a vampire can only be defeated if he, I guess, or she, is distracted long enough, drinking the blood of a woman who is pure of heart, so that they do not hear the cock's first crow and know that it is sunrise.
Yes,
So,
and that it must be willingly shared. I don't know if
yes,
you
it
noted
must be.
that. Yeah.
Yes, it's all about consent here.
um yes, yeah, what a good guy Orlok is. It's like you gotta give it willingly.
Yeah.
Although we see him super not do that.
No,
Yeah.
we don't, and we get more of like a Orlok Nosferatu being like a very lovelorn kind of incel-ish character in the Herzog remake in the 70s, and I imagine we're definitely gonna get more of that in the Robert Eggers one coming out next year.
The first incel. You heard it here. We found the first incel. It was Nosferatu. It was, although interesting note, I should correct myself. Nosferatu is not the character. Nosferatu is a Romanian word for vampire.
Yes.
And Romanian,
right.
Romanian vampire mythology is interesting because they have the concept of dead and alive vampires. So Strigoi, so there's Nosferatu are vampires, Strigoi are living vampires, and Moroi are dead vampires.
Oh my gosh.
So in the interest, yes, for any of those like vampire, real committed vampire fans, I will acknowledge that Nosferatu is the word for vampire. Count Orlok is a Nosferatu.
Yes. Thank you for the correction and for that information. We strive on this series to give you the most up to date,
yes, total and exhaustive accuracy
vampire lore. Yes. So Mina/Ellen reads this information and goes, well, no one else is really doing anything about this here.
I'm the only pure of heart woman in this town.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not like the other girls. And also, meanwhile, like, I know we haven't really mentioned it much, but Jonathan/Thomas's boss, Knock, I believe is his name.
I think so, yeah.
He is kind of given the Renfield character, and Renfield is a character in the original novel who is kind of both this is an example of worst case scenario and what could happen to you if you become one of Dracula's victims/fledglings. He also exists to kind of just be expository man and be like, no, he's coming, you don't know what you're up against. So that is basically the Knock character in this movie. And there's just like a little kind of moment that goes nowhere where he escapes, I guess, or I don't know. He's like running around and they're like, we gotta catch him, and he's just chilling on the rooftop. And but yes, he is.
I think that he kind of brings this element of like the angry mob with pitchforks and torches. Yeah. So, which is interesting because like he's on this roof and people start throwing rocks at him.
So yes, he plays the Renfield character who espouses lines such as "the master is coming," and I think Orlok kills him off screen. He's kind of done with him.
So that's one of the ambiguous plot elements to me. Like there are some things that I find that were a little harder to track, like. The Van Helsing character is introduced in a card and just kind of appears from nowhere and then has no relevance aside from what is a very cool moment with the Venus flytrap, but it is really kind of an aside from the film in a way.
It's not the first time he's introduced teaching a lecture. We get that again with Anthony Hopkins' portrayal in the Bram Stoker's Dracula version. So I guess, it's just kind of like visual imagery reinforcing this man is a learned academic. So.
Yes. Yeah. This idea of bringing scientific veracity to a folklore and a myth, like a mythic tale kind of thing, is really interesting.
Exactly. And yes, so we come to the final very famous scene where Ellen/Nina commits a act of self-sacrifice to save everyone, and Count Orlok comes to drink her blood. Again, I don't know if this is where we get the shot, but we have the shot of him just, again, very still with his hands up, looking out the window right across
Yes, yeah.
the street.
He's just staring, like waiting for her to appear in the window.
Yeah,
Yes,
I mean,
and then she kind of does something that indicates that he can come on over.
Yeah. Yeah, she texted him, "You up?"
Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So he comes and drinks her blood, and as he is approaching the shadow of his hand, I think this is where, again, another famous shot. We get the shadow going up the staircase.
Yes, and the shadow of his hands kind of creeping up her chest and her breasts to her face.
Yes, there is a sexualized component to this blood drinking that is not there.
Yeah. And I will say, in addition to being very famous and undeniably beautiful and striking, those shots are also impressive for their difficulty. I have done some shooting on Bolex film cameras, and I believe that that's what they shot on as well. And silhouettes are some of the most difficult shots to do on film, because your exposure has to be right on, and the focus also has to be right on. And focusing a shot on a Bolex camera or any film camera is difficult because you don't have you don't have like a monitor built into your camera. You have no idea if your focus was right until you develop that film and get it back. And so that's why if you see images of old film productions, or even now, you'll see people with rulers and tape measures so that they can know exactly how far the subject is from the camera. So those shots that you see of the silhouettes, and there are a few of them, that would have required quite a lot of precision and preparation, on the part of the camera operator. And so that's another reason that those shots are so impressive and remain impressive to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. So Count Orlok Dracula comes and drinks Mina's blood, and we see. Well, we don't see. Do we see a chicken crown? Or
we do. We get a nice insert. We get a nice insert shot of the rooster crowing the dawn.
Yes, and Count Orlok slowly looks up. Walks to the window, because that's always what you want to do if you are trying to avoid sunlight. And we see him strike a stance of one hand on his chest, the other reaching outward in profile, before poof, he is gone, and there is a bit of flame left. So, first on screen, death of a vampire from sunlight.
Yes, this established that aspect of the lore. You're correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the evil is defeated, but at a cost. Ellen/Mina dies, and
she does? I thought she was fine.
No, hold on. She.
Wow. Okay. This really changes my view of the film. I thought she shook it off.
No, like they don't have blood transfusions. They don't know what her blood type is. So yeah, no, unfortunately, she commits, she sacrifices her life to save everyone, and dies. And Count Orlok / Dracula is defeated. The evil is defeated, and we get a final shot, a great final shot of a castle, which is Count Orlok's castle, on the cliff. End film.
Yes, and it's collapsed into ruins. And one of the, as you mentioned, this is a really, really interesting shot because it also ties all the way back to our first shot of the town square. Yes. And we return to that idea of space and of space that must be protected. And so, we start our film with a shot of, a bell tower and a church tower. And then we end on the vanquished ruins of our invading others space. Yes.
It's a great. a great bookend moment as a contrasting image to the opening shot.
Yeah.
All right, so that was Nosferatu. Elliot, what'd you think?
It was really interesting. I was surprised by how much the film was about the idea of plague. It really did not feel like it was about Orlok, and it was more about the effect that Orlok had on this town that he arrived to. Because like we don't get any sense of like how did Orlok become a vampire? What was his human life like? We don't really even get a sense of his motivation for moving to this town. So it's very much about the effect that he has. And
yeah, he basically becomes he has no dialogue.
Yes.
For like the second half of the film.
Yes, yeah, which is really interesting. And I think just speaking to those themes, about about illness and plague and an invading force, while all of the stuff with like our Renfield proxy and Nina figuring out how she can vanquish Orlok, we have some really, really striking shots of how the town is handling this, where we have a shot of a man going door to door and marking the doors with crosses. And we also have this really gorgeous wide shot of a procession of coffins slowly being carried down the streets. And so I was really struck by the prevalence of those themes, and that we don't really spend so much time with our vampire doing vampire stuff. So that was something that really interested me.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're correct that the film certainly focuses much more on the effects of Orlok Dracula and kind of how he is not even necessarily an individual or character in this movie. He represents basically, like you said, the other. This contrast, the idea of like nature and life, and as opposed to death. This is a dead thing that still moves and walks and causes chaos everywhere in death. We have that opening line where Jonathan picks flowers for Mina, and she says, "Why'd you have to kill them? The beautiful flowers," kind of already introducing this idea of life and death.
That line was not in my version of the film that I saw
my God.
at all, which I feel like does a really undercuts some of the themes later. I would have really liked to have seen that line.
I'm so sorry. From now on, we will make sure we are watching. I don't think we have to worry about this in the future, but we'll make sure same
no,
platforms.
I actually think that the differences are really, really interesting.
Yes.
and very much reflect the difficulties of archiving film history, and like the complications of archival work and preservation in film.
The original score for the film is lost. We don't know what it is. It has multiple different scores that are used, and I'll be honest, watching the movie, the score that accompanied the version I was watching was pretty consistently going throughout the whole thing, to the point where I was like, I think some of these shots would be a lot more effective, honestly, if it was just completely silent.
I also had continuous music throughout. Thank you for bringing up the multiple scores, because that's another interesting tie into film history. Like during the silent film era, what was most common was that a movie theater would have a pianist, and so at the front of the theater, kind of below the screen, there would be a guy sitting at a piano, and he would play live music through the duration of the film. And this was such a standard part of the cinema experience that there are actually, like, we have some remaining, there were books of score music that were produced for musicians that played during films. and it was like this massive index, and so you would have there would be a section that's like songs to play while an airplane is flying, like songs to play when the characters are at a beach. So you've touched on something that was unique and interesting about Nosferatu, but also something that ties into like, again, some of our history in this form.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think another theme we, said we would address later on, and I think is very important to this film's legacy and its history and shouldn't be overlooked, is certainly the theme of anti-Semitism, and how this is not unique in terms of the context in which this film was made, in which specific film kind of period it was made. It was made, I think, as I said earlier, during the Weimar Republic in Germany, which was, I want to say, like, it was like early 1900s to, later 1920s. But so you had Weimar cinema, and that's where you had famous kind of expressionist works like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. You had Metropolis, but there's a lot of recurring themes in these films that kind of uncomfortably show maybe the state of mind that the German public was in, especially in the case of this film, when it comes to sort of this idealized romanticization of like an old Germany, a bucolic kind of pastoral, I think, to
the motherland.
To quote my literature, a Gemeinschaft as a kind of idea of Germany, and Count Orlok being a representative of this nefarious ulterior other who is going to come and bring plague and death and destroy that and take pure German women.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's also significant to mention, like, you're giving us some context for the feelings of nationalism, but one of the reasons that this film, one of the conversations around this film is around anti-Semitism, is that anti-Semitism was not invented by the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the culmination of centuries of anti-Semitic sentiment, and specifically like a concerted ramping up of anti-Semitism in the 10 or so years leading up to World War II and the Holocaust. And so some of those old anti-Semitic ideas, the idea of like Jewish people bringing illness, like before the Holocaust, there were pogroms and like mass killings that happened historically throughout Eastern Europe, where like Jewish communities were burned and Jewish people were killed and burned. And so, those things were like ancient even at that time, like this wasn't a new idea. I think is important to foreground and mention, which is one of the reasons why it's important to talk about this, because like putting it in a filmic context might have been new, but these like cultural sentiments and these like cultural biases were not new by any means.
Yes, absolutely. And also, as we said, the anti-Semitic connotations of this film can be seen quite clearly in the makeup design for Count Orlok. And so that brings us to kind of the issue of maybe how intentional or unintentional was this depiction on the part of F.W. Murnau, who himself was a gay man, and by all accounts was close with Jewish people, had Jewish friends.
Yeah, and worked closely with Jewish people because I think it's important to mention that German expressionism was a cinematic style that was very much influenced and defined by the work of Jewish filmmakers. And one of the ways that noir cinema came to be in America was that many Jewish people fled Germany and fled Eastern Europe, and came to America. And we wanted those people to work in our film industry because that style was so popular, so renowned, and we, we wanted a piece of that. So, this was not done altruistically, but we did welcome Jewish filmmakers into the American film space so that they could help us cultivate the noir aesthetic. And so that's another complicating factor as well, was that this was a style that was developed by Jewish filmmakers and Jewish artists fairly significantly.
Yes. So the intention behind the character design of Count Orlok on the part of Murnau and other production members and creatives, while not necessarily intentional, was, you could definitely say, careless.
Yes.
And to kind of reinforce that, it's intent regardless, can only excuse or make up for so much, because when the thing is out there, it is out there, and people will take that in whatever way they will. I have an excerpt here from an article about the film from Grunge, where it says, one member of the audience at Nosferatu's premiere leaped on this concept, that concept being anti-Semitism. And that was Julius Streicher, who would become chief editor of Hitler's anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. And according to an article from the blog of the Museum of the Jewish People at Beit Hot Futsot, sorry if I mispronounced that, Streicher was so transfixed by the film that he returned to watch it repeatedly. Later on in the pages of Der Stürmer, Streicher would repeatedly use art and prose to conflate Jews with vampires, making Jewish people out to be rat-faced, bloodthirsty plague spreaders.
Yes, so I think you raise a really important point that, while Murnau himself might have, had Jewish friends, worked with Jewish artists, maybe even been a proponent of Jewish liberation in his private life, we don't know. Regardless of the intent of his work, its legacy does undeniably fall into the legacy and history of anti-Semitism. And as you're saying, one of the things in the arts and entertainment that we think about and talk about a lot is the death of the author. And that, once something is given to an audience, what they do with it has just as much power, if not more so, than what the author of that work meant to do with it. And so while it may be true that Murnau never thought of or considered or intended any of these visual elements, any of these plot elements to be taken as a justification for anti-Semitism, the reality remains that some people with significant power interpreted the film that way. And used it as part of the propaganda machine that justified, the atrocities committed against Jewish people in the decades to come. So I think, questions of legacy are, really important, especially when we talk about a film with as much reach and cultural, cachet as something like Nosferatu. So I think that is a really important aspect of the legacy to talk about. It would be a disservice to not talk about that. But I also think that there are other legacies that this film has. Yes. And so I wondered if you might want to, what do you see as some of the other aspects of this film's legacy, because it's played a massive role in culture, it's played a massive role in cinema.
Yes, I think, the legacy of this film, I think, can be like one of its legacies is very firmly that of like establishing a lot of the form, structure, motifs, themes, all of that when it comes to like horror as a genre in cinema, especially when it comes to the depiction of a monster. I would say this is not only one of the first vampire films. I would say it's arguably one of the first creature feature films.
I would agree with that assessment. Yes.
Yes, and like when it comes to kind of the horror elements it establishes, I think like a lot of it is, how do we make the monster look as scary as we can? How does this monster move? What angles and framing do we utilize to give this creature a sense of kind of omnipotence or power or dominance? A lot of things in that regard that I think would be utilized, or not even utilized, just kind of establish how horror films were made later on in the canon of film.
Yes.
And so I think, that's definitely, it's another of its most important legacy, which is just its significance in the genre of horror.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And I think other ways that we see that is like this notion of a plot arc where like a creepy thing starts happening. You think it has to do with a monster. You start doing academic and historical research on that monster in order to understand how to defeat it. And then you like build and execute a plan based on that investigation that you've done. And that is something that we see over and over and over again. Like in The Ring, she goes through the microfiche and finds the news articles. In It, one of the boys goes to the library and he starts going through the archives. Like we like Teen Wolf, Styles kind of takes on this role as the researcher of the group, where he figures out what's going on. And this idea of searching down dark ancient texts, this idea of consulting with scientists. You're right that is something that plays a role in the horror genre to this day. And I think you're also right that this idea of developing the lore around the vampire, that this is the first film and the first anything really that introduces this in Western canon, at least, that introduces this idea of sunlight killing a vampire. And this is our first time like seeing blood being drunk for life-saving purposes.
He did the thing.
Yes, he did the thing. He did what we have determined is our deciding characteristic of a vampire film. He drinks blood. Yes, and I think that yes, this film is very much establishing some of the tried and true beats that we hit in the horror genre, but also in the vampire genre, which has a lot of overlap with horror, but is absolutely could not be said to be completely confined to horror.
Absolutely. And I'm kind of curious, I think we touched on a little bit earlier with the Mina character, but I'm curious how you see the theme of sexuality, sexual desire in this film, because that is a very prevalent theme in a lot of vampire media. And like it starts early. It's like fully at the front when we get to Bela Lugosi's Dracula, which is the idea of like, I don't want him to drink my blood, but I kind of do.
Yes,
Granted, Bela Lugosi maybe looks a little bit better than.
Yeah, I think that is. I think I'm very interested in sexuality and the body in cinema, so I absolutely appreciate this question. Because I think that this film primarily engages with repulsion and disgust, but that is a coin with two sides, and the other side is desire and fascination and magnetism, And so I think that the film, for the first, 75% of it, we're very much in that realm of repulsion. We are repulsed by Orlok. We are meant to fear him and his space, his castle, what he does. but like you said a little earlier, like there even then there's the intimacy of like desiring Jonathan Thomas's precious blood and sitting with him by the fire and drinking from his neck, so I think that when we think about desire and sexuality in this film, it very much comes back to Ellen Mina, and there is an eroticism to her kind of in these shift dresses, these night dresses, like coming from her bed and kind of dancing in this sheer gown on the kind of stone balcony, where her first trance state that she enters, I believe she almost falls off of the balcony of the building that she's in. And so, and just like her body language.
Sorry, that was my partner's very loud cat.
Yes, so he agrees. But just like Ellen Mina's body language, the way that she swoons, the way that others often catch or hold her. We see her not being able to stand on her own 2 feet a lot. And so this idea of like the body that kind of is managed or kind of protected by others. And then that shot of Orlok's hands creeping up over her chest as she sleeps. And while we see Orlok drink from Jonathan Thomas, when he drinks from Ellen Mina, it is quite extended, and she lies in her bed, and he is kneeling beside her with his face completely buried in her neck. And so that is a very intimate image, and this idea of like the marriage bed kind of being perverted or invaded.
Yeah, definitely. And like, what kind of body is it that is being desired, being protected, being handled?
Yes.
It is a white, middle-class, married German woman from 1838.
Yes. With a proper husband and a proper job, and all of these things. And we only ever see her doing proper things. We see her sewing. We see her sitting at the table drinking tea. We see her like taking in the air at the beach. You're right that she's very much exemplifying what a woman should be and how a woman should act. Even this idea of sacrifice, that a woman should give everything. Her body, her blood, her life, that all of those things should be surrendered to her community and to her husband, where she does these things in large part to protect Jonathan. And so that very much ties into our notions of who is desired. And, as the desired object, what women are expected to do, and what women are expected to sacrifice. Yeah,
absolutely. Although I still like the goth girl elements, the psychic elements. I fight for that.
No, totally. And as we said, she's kind of the brains of the operation.
Yeah. Professor, like Van Helsing, I like think of this line from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia where like Dennis's character just is like, you know what, Frank? You have been useless. Like that is literally how I just like think of that with the Van Helsing character in this. I'm just like, you have been useless.
I don't know that the main characters even ever meet the Van Helsing guy. Like he's just a total cutaway to he never integrates into the action of the story.
And he's such a pivotal character in the book, because in the book it's an entirely epistolary novel. So the book is kind of constructed. The reader has to kind of figure out what's going on. It only starts to click about halfway through, because they're either reading Jonathan diary entries, Mina diary entries, letters, newspaper headlines. Then Van Helsing comes in and, has his important, I think he has his diary or his documentation. But yeah, no, he's such a, he's an iconic character. I mean, like, you don't you don't even like necessarily think of Dracula without Van Helsing. You got
Yes,
both.
yeah.
A little bit.
And we will be covering Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing.
Oh yes.
Yeah, we're very excited. I'm very excited for that. I hope you are as well.
I am. I have not seen it in years, so
yeah.
I am excited to revisit it.
Yeah. And to your point about the Dracula being an epistolary novel, I would not consider this an epistolary film in a sense, but we do have some references, where Jonathan Thomas writes this letter and Nina reads it and receives it later. We have the book, the Book of Vampires, and then we do have a news article about the plague that we get an insert shot of, and we get some of these other writings as well. So there is a gesture to that source material.
Yes, yeah, definitely. But yeah, it is not necessarily, like you said, an epistolary novel. Honestly, the pacing of the film is interesting, and it can be a little slow.
It's incredibly slow.
Yes. Okay, I was trying to be nice.
No, you're being far too generous. The film, I'd say the first two-thirds of the film is very, very slow.
Yeah. It's a slow one, and Murnau likes his location shots. So
yes,
he's giving me some Malick vibes, some Terrence Malick, like, ooh, look at this bird flying through the trees. It's like, no, Murnau, back to the plot. Yes,
and I think I'd imagine that their hope was that they would build the slow sense of dread. I mean, but another question is that, like, does this film feel slow because we're a modern viewer? Like, when Casablanca was released, the average length of a shot was 30 seconds. And now the approximate average length of a shot is 7 seconds. Films have gotten faster. Stories have gotten faster. We have less time. We have shorter attention spans. And so we feel that this film is very slow, but it's difficult to say how contemporary to the time of its release, how those audiences felt. Maybe they thought this was a real thriller. a real like a roller coaster,
arm seat grabber.
Yes, yeah. We should rate films on how tight you're gripping those armrests.
Oh, I love that.
Yes,
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And like you said, I love me an atmospheric film. I don't mind a slow burn, but I kind of wish this film did have a little more atmosphere. And some of that is just due to the time it was made and the constraints they were under. Like, for example, all the scenes are during the day. Yeah. So no nighttime shots. A lot of the sets, while I said earlier, great that they're location accurate, they don't necessarily have kind of the flair or kind of subconscious, ooh, look at that an expressionist set has, or, other expressionist films at the time. There's not even really a specific, like, I don't know if Gothic's accurate. I don't know, like, what, architectural style you would call the houses or the castle.
There is some variance. I wouldn't say that they're all speaking to the same kind of aesthetic or time period.
Right, because they also filmed in different locations as well. Yeah. But another thing is, I think I said earlier, is like, I honestly feel like this film would have been more creepy or effective if it didn't have a score.
Interesting, yeah.
Because like the shots of him, slowly being raised up on the ship or coming up the stairs or like slowly walking, those scenes are iconic and I remember them so vividly. But I think when I saw them like for the first time, it was without any sound or music, which I think kind of would add more to a creepy atmosphere.
So you're saying it's quite loud for a silent film.
It was so loud I couldn't hear the actors.
Yes, but no, I actually in my notes that I was taking, I did mention that the score sometimes felt like it undermined the emotion of a scene, where they would be like talking about like the dead on the ship and they're looking at the captain's diary and it's like 3 dead, 5 dead, and there's like a happy flute playing in the background.
Yeah, it's important to know when not to use music and sound.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's, again, we don't know what the original soundtrack or score, not soundtrack.
Yes, yeah, that's entirely
By
possible that there were these silences, and you know, that's one of the things that
pauses.
we'll just never know.
Yeah, because, you know, it's kind of a miracle in and of itself. We just have this movie as it is.
Mm-hmm.
So, Elliot, any favorite moments?
I'm trying to think. I have to say that I think that the silhouette shots that we get throughout the film, I think, you know, the hands creeping up, his shadow on the stairs. There's another really lovely silhouette that happens a bit earlier in the film. Let me look for it, because yes, at around 21 minutes in, we have a really beautiful silhouette. And yeah, so I think that those were the high points of the film for me, just in terms of their beauty, but also just the knowledge of how hard those shots are to get. So
yeah.
And what about you? What do you have a greatest hits?
Greatest hits. I think for me, it still stays the shots of Count Orlok, the kind of iconic shots of Max Schreck as this character either slowly approaching the camera or maybe the one on the ship, but also I found a new appreciation for that low angle shot of him slowly walking across the ship. And I think for me, you know, kind of my biggest appreciation or love of movies, or the component of movies, is the actors within it and the acting. I am always fascinated by an iconic performance, a great actor, their choices, why some characters, you know, remain in the public the way that they do. And I think watching this movie again, I'm like, yeah, there's a good reason Nosferatu, or this character of Count Orlok, has remained so memorable, because Max Schreck did give an incredible performance. And like you said earlier, silent film acting is very different. We're kind of still come from that theatrical place. There wasn't dialogue. You had to really be more emotive and expressive. And so I appreciate that, you know, his performance here is very kind of reserved and pulled back. It's in a lot of the physicality and the stillness of it, and it's incredibly effective. And I'm like, yeah, I can see why this guy was like in 100 silent movies and had a very long career. And I think by all accounts was a really cool, nice guy, but also kind of a little weird, maybe. Like he was all about his career. I don't have time for family and like friends. Maybe I could be wrong. If I'm getting this wrong, I apologize, Max Schreck. Well, I just want to say I think you're a great actor.
Yeah, I think there were some rumors about him. His last name means terror, which is interesting. But I totally agree on that. On the performance and this kind of the reservedness of the performance, especially in contrast to Jonathan Thomas, whose face is doing the most at all times, is really, and just very, very like much more free and open with his body, much more kind of bombastic body movement and facial expression. And so you're right that contrast to Orlok is turned up even more so, I think. And definitely I think that the slowness of it kind of speaks to this idea of like being dead and being ancient, you know, that like that Orlok is kind of like, I don't have to move fast, I'm gonna get you anyway. I'm 1,000 years old.
I move with intention.
Yeah, exactly.
I move with intention.
He has a very mindfulness approach to his life. He's what is the sleep of the dead but meditation?
Exactly. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. I think that concludes our first ever episode on Nosferatu. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And next week, we will be talking about our first on screen Dracula that will speak. And what an iconic speaking voice he has.
Thank you for listening to another episode of This Podcast Sucks.
Find us where you get your podcasts, follow us on social media, and give us a like.
We'd love to hear from you guys, and remember, stay bloodthirsty.
Catch our next episode on 1931's Dracula.